My sister's daughter threw my birthday gift into the fire and said, "Mom said you're just a failure who deserves nothing." Everyone laughed, even my parents. I left without a word. 2 hours later, they sent a family group text, "You're officially cut out of everything." I just replied, "Good. Check whose name owns the house you live in." 5 minutes later, my phone started vibrating nonstop, 31 missed calls by the next morning. I, 32M, never expected my own birthday to be the catalyst for the permanent destruction of my family, but looking back, the signs of their contempt were always there. I was always the scapegoat, the quiet one who was expected to absorb the disrespect, while my older sister was the undisputed golden child. This dynamic reached its breaking point on a freezing Tuesday evening at my parents' house, where I had foolishly agreed to attend a small dinner for my 32nd birthday. The evening was already tense. I had recently purchased a vintage, leather-bound journal for myself as a birthday gift, a reward for landing a major promotion at work. It was sitting on the coffee table while I was in the kitchen helping my mother clean up. My sister's 10-year-old daughter was running wild in the living room. I heard a sudden rustling, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the stone hearth of the fireplace. I walked into the living room, just in time to see my niece tossing my new journal directly into the roaring fire. I froze, staring as the leather curled and caught flame. When I asked her what she was doing, she turned to me with a smug, practiced look and proudly announced that her mother had told her I was just a failure who deserved absolutely nothing. The silence that followed was deafening, but it only lasted for a second before the laughter started. I looked at my sister, expecting her to scold her child, but she was giggling behind her hand. I then looked at my parents. My father was chuckling, shaking his head as if my niece had just told a clever joke, and my mother walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, smiling affectionately at her granddaughter's audacity. No one offered an apology. No one made a move to salvage my property. They simply looked at me, waiting for me to lower my head and accept the humiliation like I always did. Instead, I turned around, grabbed my coat from the hallway rack, and walked out the front door without uttering a single word. I ignored my mother calling out behind me that I was being too sensitive and ruining the evening. I got into my car and drove away, feeling a strange, icy calm wash over me. 2 hours later, while I was sitting alone in my apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a message in the family group text. My sister had taken the lead, sending a long paragraph stating that my dramatic exit had ruined the family dynamic. She declared that I was toxic, that my parents were exhausted by my constant need for validation, and that, as of that moment, I was officially cut out of everything. My mother chimed in immediately after, agreeing with my sister, and stating that they needed peace from my negative energy. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling the last thread of familial obligation snap. I typed out a brief reply, confirming that this arrangement was perfectly fine with me. I then added a suggestion that they check the county property records to see exactly whose name was on the deed to the house they were currently living in. I hit send, turned my phone on silent, and went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, my phone screen was a wall of notifications. There were 31 missed calls, split evenly between my mother, my father, and my sister. Update 1. To understand the panic in those 31 missed calls, you have to understand the history of that house. 6 years ago, my parents were drowning in debt and facing imminent foreclosure. My sister was deep in her own financial ruin at the time and was of no help. I was the only one who had saved diligently. Desperate, my parents had begged me for a loan. Instead of handing them cash they would inevitably lose, I offered a different solution. I bought the house from the bank, paying off their massive arrears and taking over the property entirely in my name. The agreement was simple. They would pay a fraction of the market rent to cover the property taxes and maintenance. For the first year, they managed it. By the second year, the payments stopped. My mother pleaded poverty, and I, wanting to keep the peace, let it slide. 3 years ago, my sister lost her apartment and moved into my house with her daughter. They took over the master bedroom, pushed my parents into the guest room, and treated the property like their own personal kingdom. Because I lived quietly in a modest apartment closer to the city, they had completely compartmentalized the reality of the situation. They had convinced themselves that it was still their house, and that I was just the wealthy, distant relative who occasionally showed up to be the punchline of their jokes. My text message shattered that delusion. I spent the morning listening to the voicemails. The progression of their panic was almost clinical to observe. The first few voicemails, left just minutes after my text, were from my sister, angrily demanding to know what kind of sick joke I was playing. By the 10th call, my father had taken over, his tone shifting from authoritative to hesitant, asking me to pick up the phone so we could talk like adults and clear up this misunderstanding. The final calls, left around 3 in the morning, were from my mother, sobbing into the receiver, swearing that my sister had taken my phone and sent that group text without their permission, and begging me to call them back. I did not call them back. Instead, I called my real estate attorney. I explained the situation to him in full detail, noting that there was no formal lease agreement in place, making them month-to-month tenants by default. I instructed him to draft a formal, unconditional 30-day notice to vacate the premises. My lawyer asked if I was absolutely certain about proceeding with this, warning me that evicting family members was an incredibly ugly process. I assured him that they had made it perfectly clear they were no longer my family, and I wanted the notice served as quickly as legally possible. Update 2. The process server delivered the eviction notice 3 days later. I was at work when my phone started exploding again. This time, I didn't even bother listening to the voicemails. I routed all their numbers to a silent folder. Realizing they could not reach me directly, they began deploying extended family members as flying monkeys. My aunt called me that evening, adopting a deeply disappointed tone. She lectured me about family loyalty and asked how I could possibly throw my own parents and young niece out onto the street over a silly misunderstanding. I stopped her mid-sentence. I calmly explained the reality of the situation. That they had been living rent-free in a home I owned and maintained for years. That my niece had destroyed my property while they cheered her on, and that they were the ones who had formally cut me out of the family via text message. I told my aunt that I was simply respecting their boundaries by removing myself and my assets from their lives. My aunt was stunned into silence, mumbled an awkward apology, and quickly ended the call. The extended family intervention stopped entirely after that. A week passed. My sister, realizing that intimidation and family pressure were failing, took to social media. She posted a lengthy, vague diatribe about how money changes people, and how heartbreaking it was to be betrayed by someone she had loved and supported her whole life. She claimed she was facing homelessness as a single mother due to corporate greed, completely omitting the fact that her brother was her landlord, and that she had never paid a dime in rent. A few of her friends left sympathetic comments, but I felt nothing reading them. I simply took screenshots of everything and forwarded them to my lawyer to keep on file in case she tried to claim any sort of harassment. By the end of the second week, my father showed up at my office building. I was walking out to get lunch when I saw him pacing near the entrance. He looked visibly older, his usual arrogant posture completely gone. He approached me, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, and pleaded for just 5 minutes of my time. I stood there, arms crossed, and let him speak. He apologized for the incident at my birthday, claiming he had been drinking and had not realized how hurtful their reactions had been. He promised that if I tore up the eviction notice, my sister would start paying rent and things would go back to normal. He begged me not to make them pack up their entire lives. I looked at him and felt an absolute void of emotion. I reminded him that they had lived in my house for 6 years without gratitude, that they had allowed my sister to treat me like dirt, and that their apology was only happening because they were facing the consequences of their own cruelty. I told him that the eviction stood, that they had 20 days left to vacate, and that if they were not out by the deadline, I would have the sheriff forcibly remove them. I then turned around and walked back into my building, ignoring his desperate pleas for me to wait. Update 3. The final 2 weeks of the eviction period were a masterclass in denial, finally breaking down. As the deadline loomed, the reality of the rental market hit my family hard. Because my parents had ruined their credit years ago, and my sister had a history of evictions before moving in with them, no reputable landlord in the area would approve their applications. My mother started sending me lengthy emails, as she was still blocked on my phone. The emails were frantic. She detailed the rejections they were facing from apartment complexes and begged me to extend the notice by just 3 months so they could figure something out. She tried to guilt-trip me by describing how my niece was crying every night because she would have to change schools. I forwarded the emails to my lawyer and instructed him to respond on my behalf. He sent a brief, formal reply stating that the timeline was non-negotiable and reminding them that any damage done to the property upon exit would result in immediate civil litigation. 3 days before the deadline, my sister attempted her final desperate maneuver. She contacted a legal aid clinic and tried to file an emergency injunction to halt the eviction, claiming she was an established tenant and that I was retaliating against her illegally. Because we had documented everything perfectly, and because there was a clear record of them paying absolutely no rent, the judge threw her request out almost immediately. The legal aid attorney reportedly told her she had no leg to stand on and advised her to start packing. The weekend before they had to be out, I drove past the house. The lawn, which I used to pay a landscaping company to maintain until I canceled the service 2 weeks prior, was already looking overgrown. A large moving truck was parked in the driveway. From the safety of my car across the street, I watched my father and a few of my sister's friends haul in boxes and furniture out of the front door. My sister was standing on the porch, furiously smoking a cigarette and yelling directions at everyone, looking absolutely miserable. I watched them for about 10 minutes. I didn't feel a sense of triumph or joy. I just felt a profound, heavy exhaustion lifting off my shoulders. Update 4. The deadline passed on a Tuesday at noon. I arrived at the property at 1 p.m., accompanied by a locksmith and a private property inspector I had hired. The house was empty. Walking through the front door felt surreal. The place smelled of stale smoke, something I had explicitly forbidden, and the carpets were heavily stained. In the living room, right next to the fireplace where my journal had been burned, there was a massive gouge in the drywall, clearly the result of a piece of furniture being violently shoved into it during the move. My niece's room was covered in crayon marks, and the kitchen appliances were coated in a thick layer of grease. It was obvious they had stopped cleaning the moment the eviction notice arrived, perhaps as a final, petty act of defiance. I documented every single scuff, stain, and broken fixture with the inspector. The total estimated cost of repairs and deep cleaning came out to nearly $8,000. I authorized the repairs immediately, paying out of pocket, and instructed my lawyer to file a small claims suit against my parents and sister for the property damage. I knew I would likely never see a dime of that money, given their financial situations, but I wanted the judgment on their records. It was the principle of the matter. A month later, the house was completely renovated. Fresh paint, new carpets, upgraded appliances. It looked entirely different from the dark, oppressive place my family had turned it into. I put it on the market the very next day. Because I had bought it at the bottom of the market during their financial crisis, the property value had nearly doubled. It sold in less than 2 weeks for significantly over the asking price. As for my family, I heard through the grapevine of a mutual cousin that they had fractured under the pressure. Unable to find a place together, my parents were forced to move into a tiny, run-down, one-bedroom apartment in a bad part of town. My sister, completely abandoning them when they could no longer provide a roof over her head, took her daughter and moved 3 states away to live with a boyfriend she had met online. They were completely shattered, financially and emotionally. The day the funds from the house sale cleared into my bank account, I sat in my quiet apartment and opened a new journal. I poured myself a drink and started writing. For the first time in 32 years, I didn't have to worry about managing my parents' failures, navigating my sister's toxicity, or apologizing for my own success. They had asked to cut me out of everything, and I had simply obliged. It was the greatest gift they could have ever given me.